Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Welcome and welcome back to Rooted to Thrive, conversations that elevate our humanity podcast. I'm your host, Professor P. Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, and today we have Dr. Bill Ayers, retired distinguished professor of education from the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's an activist who has written extensively about freedom, education, and democracy. He's also the host of, I want to get it right, Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom. That podcast. So I encourage you to tune in over there too. But today we're going to dive into Bill's thought leadership on concepts from his most recent book, published in 24. That's When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. Reflections on Collective Liberation. And I have had the pleasure of reading this book, so I am ecstatic about the opportunity to dive deeper into the subject. Now, Bill and I actually recently met, but he has been a vicarious mentor for me for years. My first book that I picked up where I met you was The Courage to Teach. And it actually was on the bookshelves at a local charter school, Imhotep High School here in Philadelphia. And I was graced with a copy of the book. This was many years ago. And I remember thinking I could just devour all that you had to share. I have the Social Justice and Education Reader that you edited with Dave Stovall on my bookshelf as well, and more. But today, I am so honored to have this conversation with you. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and it's just an honor to be with you, Professor P. I'm going to call you that, Professor
Yes,
P. I
yes, yes,
like it.
yes. Thank you. Well, I'm excited to talk about, the terms that are in your latest book, right? Like just unpacking what freedom, abolition, and collective liberation looks like today. Yes. So to get started, can you just share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work?
Well, it's interesting. It's a circuitous path. Most paths are. I
Mhm.
made my wobbly way into the world. At the age of 20, I had been drawn into the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement, and I was an activist in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was a student. And then the Vietnam War blew up, and I became very active in that. Initially, my first time being arrested in civil disobedience was opposing the American war in Vietnam. And I was put in county jail for 10 days, and I met a man whose wife had founded a freedom school. And I'd never thought of myself as an educator going into education, but I went out of that 10-day stint in county jail. I walked over to this spot where the Freedom School was meeting. It was in a basement of a Quaker meeting house. And I was hooked. And from that moment until this, I've thought of myself mainly as a teacher. So that's 60 years of thinking of myself as a teacher, although I've done many things. I've been a community organizer, I've been a professor. But deep down, that first that first moment is still electrifying for me. And I think what captured me was, well, the young people captured me. I realized I had a lot to learn. And, when I was first teaching, I had this crisis because I thought that a teacher was somebody who stood at the front of the room, the master and commander, and led everybody down the road. And I quickly realized when I had my first real teaching job a few years later, I was teaching kindergarten, and a kid said to me, I was about 10 in the morning, and a kid said to me, "Why does the ball bounce?" And I thought, oh my God, I've been in school for 15 minutes and I've been stumped by a 5-year-old. And then by noon that first day, my ignorance had spread far and wide. I didn't know, not only did I not know why the ball bounced, I didn't know why the sky was blue. I didn't know why my skin was pink when her skin was brown, and on and on. I knew nothing. Luckily, somebody said, "Why is the table sticky when we spill apple juice?" I knew that. I knew the answer to that. So, but the crisis led to a deep realization, and that is that the image of the teacher as the master and commander is upside down. And if the teacher thinks of herself or himself or themselves as people who are on a voyage of discovery and surprise with their students. In other words, not only becoming a student of your students, but becoming a fellow traveler, and not just an ally, but a co-conspirator, and asking the hard questions together. It's
Mhm.
not the job of the teacher to be Socrates exactly, but it seems to me the job of the teacher is to keep a wide angle, accept the fact that you know very little in this vast and expanding and infinite universe. You know a tiny bit. And you
Mhm.
and I, to take two examples, have been
Mhm.
able to leverage that tiny bit that we do know against the mountain that we don't know.
That's
So
right.
what we want is to be, we want to, whatever else we teach, we want to teach kids certain fundamental lessons. One is you have every right to be here as a human
Yes.
being, as a full
Yes.
human being. Two is that you have every right to interrogate the world and to ask questions of the world and to seek answers.
Mhm.
And third, you are the one of one. There will never be another like you. You are sacred to me. You are visible to me. And at the same time, you're one of the group. You're
Mhm.
just like you and me. We're unique, and we're also just like every other human being in that we were born, we suffer, we will die, and we share a human culture. But I think
Mhm.
those are complicated contradictions to live out in a teaching life. But that's where I begin.
Yes, yes. And I can imagine knowing about freedom schools that the seed was planted there, right?
For sure.
To see teaching as both an individual, an act you bring your uniqueness to, but something that's done in community
Right.
with
I
your
think that's
students.
important. That's important that we understand that teaching exists in contradiction, and the contradictions are many. You want to see each student as unique human being. You want to see all
Mhm.
of us as part of the group. You want to ask questions. The great thing about freedom schools is they developed a curriculum of question asking and problem posing. And then
Mhm.
they created a pedagogy of dialogue, speaking with the possibility of being heard, but listening with the possibility of being changed.
Mm.
And one of the things about that approach to teaching is it warns you against self-righteousness or certainty, and I think that's important no matter what, no matter where you are. I'm suddenly thinking of, you know, when I taught little kids, kindergarten and preschool, I would always put red, yellow, and blue paint at the easel. And people would be like, "Why red, yellow, and blue?" And somebody would say, "Well, those are the primary colors." But that's not how I approached it. I put red, yellow, and blue. And every month, some 5-year-old or 6-year-old would say to me, "Look, Bill, if you put red and blue, it's purple." And I could say, if I were a certain kind of teacher, "Weren't you listening to my primary colors lecture last week?" Or I could say, "Wow, how did you do that? What else could you discover?" And what the kids learn through that, another essential lesson, their own agency is how
Mhm.
they learn, their own activity, their own creations.
Hmm.
And so every month somebody would say, I discovered orange or I discovered green. And
Hmm.
each time I had to seriously, authentically experience that as a,
That's
oh my gosh, wow moment. It's like,
yes.
it's like I've taught a bunch of kids, including all my kids and I think most of my grandkids, how to ride a bike.
Okay.
Now, I could give a lecture to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old about
Mhm.
gyroscopes. And now you're on a bike, you're in the middle of a gyroscope, and this is how a gyroscope, but that's not how you teach someone to ride a bike. You teach them by running along behind them, holding the saddle, breaking your back until they actually figure out, how to find balance, how to keep moving, and those
Mhm.
kinds of things. If I ask a group of students, college students who are becoming teachers, if I say to them, when you're falling off of a bicycle, if you're riding on a bike and you start to fall to the left or fall to the right, where do you turn the wheel? Invariably, somebody will say, if I'm falling left, I turn right. That's exactly wrong. But who would know that unless you had the practice of it? So
Right.
learning about gyroscopes is less important than actually getting on the bike and pedaling. Agency, learning
Mhm.
from, not about, learning from history, not about history, learning from nature, not about nature, learning from the bike, not about
Mm.
the bike.
Yes. And learning from each other
That's
and
right, very much
about
so,
each other. I
very
love
much so. And,
that.
and creating a community of learners and a culture of learning. And that's easier said than done, but it's essential to being a
Mhm.
great teacher.
Yes, it is. And I have only taught, well, I've taught not formally, like in formal programs, I guess as young as fifth grade students, but through facilitation, out of school time programs, but then taught formally at the college level for the most part. And when you talked about the red, the what is the red and blue, right? Make
Yeah. Yeah,
purple.
the color purple, right.
That was the sense of discovery that I went into the college classroom with.
Well,
And
that's exactly
mhm,
the challenge, Rochelle. The challenge
mhm,
is using the discovery of the color purple as a metaphor.
right.
How do you do that in a high school class? How do you do that in a college class? Because the most important thing isn't purple. The most important thing is agency and
Yes.
creativity and action. So
Yes.
all the things that are, I think of as the arts of liberty, um,
Hmm.
initiative, courage, agency,
Hmm.
entrepreneurship. These are the lessons we ought to be teaching. And too often in our schools, we're teaching obedience,
Yeah,
conformity, rule following. Those are not the hallmarks of a free people.
that's right. That's right. And I'm glad you just brought us back to the hallmark of a free people. Right? So you taught, your book is entitled When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. And one of the things that I like about the structure of this book, right? Not only do you engage poetry throughout, but you also ask a critical question at the beginning for the reader to engage before they even start reading. And your first question, right, starting in chapter 1, was to make a list of the 5 words, like freedom, words that spark in your mind in the wake or the echo of that one word freedom, right? And so I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So let's start with you. I know a little bit about what you think now that I've read the book, but let's start unpacking that word freedom.
I think what's important, and there are a couple things that are themes in this book, and they've been kind of themes of my teaching, themes
Mhm.
of my organizing and my activism. And one is this idea that freedom is a term that's so broad and so unspecific and so emotionally charged that it's practically appliqued on our American minds. We're all for freedom, but
Mhm.
what anyone means by it is contested. And
Mhm.
so freedom, you know, freedom, what I begin thinking about is things like the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives, a reactionary, small-minded group of right-wing congressmen, or the insufferable Ron DeSantis's book, The Courage to Be Free. Or I think of the Black Freedom Movement, or I think of women's liberation or queer freedom. So the word is contested. And
Mhm.
what I try to do is unpack it in a couple of ways. One is to say that freedom for the conqueror is always cruelty, murder, and chaos for the conquered. So the United States is a country built on freedom, freedom from the British Empire. But the freedom, even in 1776, included the freedom to own other human beings, the freedom to conquer and wipe out whole communities and peoples, the freedom to support the North Atlantic slave trade. So these were freedoms too, but they weren't the freedom you and I have in mind when we get all glowy and talking about freedom and we feel all lovely about it. We have to remember that freedom for the conqueror is murder for the conquered. So that's one way that I get into it. The other thing that I think is useful and helpful, really, when we think about the question of freedom and fighting for our freedom, is that we realize that freedom can best be understood if you look squarely into the face of unfreedom. If
Mhm.
unfreedom includes racial segregation, freedom, whatever else it is, must include the end of racial segregation. If
Mhm.
unfreedom is, um, being being exploited and oppressed and ethnically cleansed, then freedom must include fighting against that. If unfreedom in our own context is restricting the right to vote in the variety of ways that it's restricted in this country, then freedom ought to mean, in part, not completely, ought to mean the right to vote. So that's part of how I get into it. I want to understand this dialectic of, freedom for the conqueror, but I also want to name the unfreedoms that press down on me and on you, and then I want to say we can beat these back. Another
Yes.
another helpful dialectic, I think, for me, is the idea that, I'm thinking suddenly of the Martin Luther King's last book, which I think is a masterpiece, and it's called "Where Do We Go From Here?" A question we should be asking ourselves every day. But the book is called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?"
Mhm.
And I think that's a really good thing to ask ourselves today. And
Mhm.
so I at some point in the book talk about the fact that freedom without community, freedom without sharing, is nothing but predation and exploitation. My freedom to build a cop academy in the middle of a park or downtown Atlanta, or my freedom to drill an oil well in your backyard. That's freedom without community. But community, or let's say socialism, without freedom can be a form of slavery. So, how do you get these two things in balance? That on
Mhm.
the one hand, we are a collective of humanity. We have to act in each other's interests. But at the same time, we can't push that so far that we end up saying, you don't matter, you're just an ant in the colony. No, I'm a human being. I've got three dimensions. I'm sacred. I'm worthwhile. And how do you keep both of those in play? That's
Mhm.
a hard one for teachers. It's a hard one for anybody.
Yeah, it's a hard one for all of us, but I would say that some of us we're going to die trying. I
That's
know,
exactly right.
you know,
That's
because
exactly right.
I
You
feel
make
like
me,
it's possible. I
you
do
say
feel,
I'm, yeah, you say I'm going to die trying. It makes me think of the prompt I gave my class last week. I teach people, I teach in the Illinois Department of Corrections, but I always give prompts, as you say, to get people writing and get everybody's voice in the room. But the prompt last week was a short poem from Langston Hughes, and the poem is "Birthin's hard, dying's mean, get some lovin' in between." And I
yeah,
love that poem. And so
yes,
I asked my students to say where they were going to get lovin' last week and next week, and it led to some beautiful, beautiful conversation.
yes. And I can imagine that it is beautiful, right? So I'm always grappling with those questions, as you mentioned, and I was one that minimized myself for the community for years, for years. And of course, there was a lot of conditioning in our society that helped me get to that place, right? In our society, in religious community, I was there, and from experiencing some trauma. And more recently, I have come into my own, right? And understood my beauty, and that I give others permission to explore their freedom, their strength, their agency through through my expression of it, my agency. But my expression of agency is always couched in the community, and I firmly know that I learned that from the Black community,
I think
right?
you're right. I think you're right. And I think there's so many lessons in what you just said. We're conditioned, some like women are conditioned to be servers, not to be agents.
Mhm.
And so that's part of what I think you're implying. But it's also true that this is a dialectic that cannot be resolved easily and once and for all. You can make mistakes on both sides every
Mhm.
day,
Right.
and so you have to kind of keep believing that you and all your students and everybody you meet on the street is the one of one, needs to be honored and respected, and awe has to be around them, but also that I'm also important, and that
Exactly.
my joy,
Mhm.
my happiness, is also part of what
Mhm.
I think we need to fight for. And I think when we think of collective freedom, um, and collective liberation, I do think that it has to embrace the individual freedom. So the Black freedom struggle did include this individual's right to drink at a drinking fountain, this individual's right to vote, but it
Mhm.
also was naming a public, Black people, who as a people were kept down because of Blackness, women kept down because of womanness,
Mhm.
queer folks, and so on. So it's, and one of my favorite examples of this is a documentary you may have seen called Crip Camp, CRIP, Crip Camp. And it's the story, it's a very moving story about how we got the Disability Rights Act. And we got it because folks who'd been isolated and weren't part of a public found themselves at a camp, found themselves at a university, and named disability as an obstacle to their full humanity. Once they named it collectively, they did the most extraordinary things, Rochelle. One of the first things they did, they were out at Berkeley, California, and they got together one night and they illegally made a curb cut in the sidewalk. They poured concrete. And it turned out that was the first act of many in which the disability rights people said, what we're doing for us, we're doing for everyone. Women with strollers wanted that curb cut. Old people with their grocery uh, bags wanted that cut. Bicyclists and so on. But it's a great example. Before the disability rights movement named itself, it was a group of individuals suffering individual harm. But once they named themselves as brothers and sisters, then they could approach the oppression arm in arm, heart to heart, collectively. That was huge.
Yes, and that's what we have to continue to do,
I think
is
so.
name ourselves as brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
I'm especially disheartened when I see, particularly in social media, right? See a number of people, like, as they're trying to elevate our voices, and I'll just say our collectively, it could be around anti-racism, anti-sexism, disability oppression, etc. Um, tend to distance themselves from other human beings by the way they say what they say. And that
Oh,
was
I
one of
see. Uh-huh.
yes, and that was one of the reasons why this podcast was born. I
I
will
see.
not participate in that.
So say more. Give me
Correct.
examples. I'm very
Oh, any
taken with it, but
example.
say more.
Oh my goodness, when anyone just, you know, some people think that to be anti-racist is to bash white people. And I'm like, well, we don't want anyone to be in pain, right? Or to be determined their character, their worthiness by this skin bag that we were born in. We do understand that all of us have been susceptible to this concept, this ideology that we called the supremacy of whiteness. And yes, there are generational messaging that we're all hearing. They're different, right? So there can be this major chasm between what I hear as a person of color or a Black person specifically, and what you might hear as a white male
Yeah.
about who you are and your
Yeah.
worthiness. However, you were born into that just like I was.
That's important. Yeah, I mean, it's important that all of us were thrust into a world not of our choosing. We
Right.
have to
And
choose who to be in that world, but we didn't choose the world.
yes, and will I convince you? Will I have the ability to lock arms with you if I immediately distance myself from you?
I understand what you're saying. I think that it brings to my mind a couple of things. One is that, you know, we were going to talk a little bit about individualism versus
Mhm.
collective liberation, but we live in a culture that is so toxically individualistic,
Yes.
that it's very hard sometimes to see that every issue you care about,
Mhm.
everything that you do has a social as well as an individual aspect. Keeping those two things in mind can be excruciating, but
Mhm.
everything has that reality. So when we think of being a moral person, well, I said when we think of being free, we tend to default to the individual when we ought to be thinking about all of us together. But when we think about ethics or morality, we say every human being thinks I'm a good person, mostly given the circumstances. I mess up here and there, but I'm pretty good. But the question is, there's a question of social ethics. If we live in a society that's out of balance, if we live in a world where men are considered superior to women, and that that belief is encoded in law, encoded in culture, if white supremacy is encoded in law and so on, then the question of being a good person has also to do with opening your eyes to the reality before you. So, for example, if as you pointed out, I'm a white man. Um, Nobody can necessarily see me, but it's a given. And of course, those are constructions too. Those are just things we made up. But okay, we've agreed as a society that this is who I am. It's not all that I am, but okay, I'll start there. And I have to say, I live in a society that was founded on white supremacy, a society in which those things were encoded in law and in practice, and they still exist. The afterlife of slavery still exists. So if I can recognize that, then me being a good person has to include me saying to myself and the world, I'm opposed to white supremacy. It's not enough for me saying I'm a good person. I don't have prejudice. The reality is I'm in this world. It's like, let me give you a better example. If I lived in the time of slavery and I was a white person living in, say, Illinois, which is where I do live, and I ignored the fact of slavery, a central fact of my country, a central fact of the wealth of my country. And if I said, well, not my business, I'm a good person. But are you, if you're benefiting and not noticing? I've
Right.
often said to I teach ethics also, and I've often said to my students, could there be a good slave owner? He never beat his wife, he never cheated anybody, but he owned 25 slaves. Could that be good? Well, people will say, well, in that time, maybe it was okay. And I'll say, yeah, well, there was an anti-slavery movement going back to the beginning. And by the way, it was not accepted by the enslaved workers. You can say it was accepted, but you're allowing yourself to be nearsighted, to be myopic, and you ought to open your eyes and look around. Same is true of men and women. I'll give you a weird example, if I may. I was teaching when I was first teaching at the University of Illinois at Chicago, a downtown urban campus. And it took me about 8 weeks to recognize that when seminar ended at 9 o'clock at night, the women gathered in a corner of the room and the men just went to the subway or their cars. And it took me so long to notice it. And finally I said, are you all gathering to kind of make each other safe? And somebody practically said, duh. But, but of course, women recognize it. I'm not a, I'm not necessarily a bad person for not recognizing it, but I had the privilege of being anesthetized. I didn't have to recognize it. So once I recognized it and I said, what are we going to do about it collectively? And then we all gathered and went out together. But it's
Yeah.
an example of how privilege puts you to sleep. It's not
Yes.
that you don't have to be it's on offer whether you want it or not. It's an
Hmm.
addictive drug and you don't need to even ask for it. It just happens. So I think and frankly, there's all kinds of privilege. There's American privilege. You don't have to pay attention to the warlike aspect of US foreign policy because you're here, you're safe, you're fine, but you ought to pay attention. That's my my plea is that we open our eyes and pay attention, even though there are all kind of forces asking us to stay asleep and keep
That's
our heads down.
That's right. Yes. I remember that part of your book stood out to me too when you were talking about your early teaching days and privilege, right? And I like the metaphor of an addictive drug. We often just talk about it being in our blind spots,
Right.
and it's there.
We talk about blind spots. We also act as if privilege is a matter of shame and guilt. I don't think it's about shame and guilt. I think it's about when you see something, do something. And
That's right.
when you become and you can't actually be a moral person or a good citizen or a good resident unless you pay attention. And paying
Yes.
attention can't be done once, one morning, and then put on automatic pilot. The world is swirling and changing, and so are you. So we have to kind of open our eyes again and again and again.
Yes. And, that discussion reminded me of my awakening around my heterosexual privilege, around my Christian privilege as well. I often open conversations about identity, talking about the fact that when I first understood my heterosexual privilege and how it was in a blind spot, that's when I got how some white folks don't understand racism. I was like,
Exactly.
oh, and
Exactly.
it literally changed my whole countenance, like around these issues. I was like, oh, right? Like I'm blaming somebody as if they understand. And you just said it's encoded
Yeah.
so many structures. That's what
Right.
we mean when we say it's a structural fill in the
Right.
blank,
Right.
racism, sexism.
But I also think what's worth noting in what you're saying is that because the world is swirling and changing, you
Mhm.
can't know everything, but you can also struggle not just to open your eyes, but to pay attention and try to be learning all the time. So, for example, I'm 80 years old. You know, now you're supposed to say you look good for 80.
Yeah, God bless
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Thank you. It's always a come on, but I'm 80 years old. So if you had said to me 25 years ago, there's this phenomenon, it's called transgender, I wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Never heard of it, never understood it, never experienced it. Doesn't mean it hasn't been existing in history. It has, but
Mhm.
I never heard of it. So the question is, what is my basic moral grounding so that when I hear about it, I have a certain response as opposed to a certain other response. Now, the problem with fascism or white supremacy or any other form of selective humanization is you think some people are born to rule or to lead or to win, and others are born to lose or to be ruled, and so on.
Mhm.
I don't believe that. I believe every one of us is of incalculable value. And because I believe that, something comes along that I've never heard of, and I have an instinctive response to it. But
Right.
also because I believe that and work in institutions like schools where judging and sorting is so much the name of the game, then I come back to my core value. Every human being is of incalculable value. That means you can't
Yes.
calculate it. And yet schools spend so much energy, so much money, so much effort trying to calculate this one is just a bit better than that one. It's insane to me. And I think we need to kind of break through those structures by recognizing them.
That's right. And it's real interesting to me. Um, it's real, real interesting to me that I think some of the individual resistance that we see comes from the communication from those in power, right? Like, so if you're in the workplace, if you're in the school, and you're forcing people to just adopt some new information without really looking at that core value that we're talking about, right? The core that everybody is valuable. People do feel put upon. I mean, I've heard people say, in terms of people with transgender identity, like something's being forced on me. Like, what is being forced on you? I don't even understand. When I peel back the layer, it's the way people are communicating with the person in the workplace, typically not a member of the group of concern, about what they should and should not do, right? And
Right.
that our relational competence has to play into how we understand the world that we're in, and help us really just slow down. Like, we have to slow down and look at really what you have an issue with. And
Mm.
it's often, I'm always taken aback when it's also people from groups that are largely oppressed in the country I live in. I'm like,
Right.
what are we doing here? And
Right.
and we know about collusion with, oppressive thinking as well, right? That helps perpetuate it. But that wins the battle, and that keeps the structures in place. So
Yeah.
as we dream about freedom and reimagine it, I'm sure different forms of abolition come to mind. And I want you to talk to us about your vision for these uh, updated forms of abolition.
But I think the most important thing is that abolition has kind of made a comeback. Of course, there's a long, long literature, a long canon of abolitionist writing and thinking, and for many people, it it's most it coheres around Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass is an heroic figure in American history. But so when we think of abolition, we tend to go to the period of slavery and the period of the abolition of slavery. But honestly, the canon about abolition goes back to the Bible, and it goes forward to today, and it takes many, many forms. But what I argue for in this book is that abolition can be understood, and importantly, is the erasure of something oppressive. So the unlocking of the chains, the freeing of the enslaved workers. But the more interesting, challenging, and difficult aspect of abolition is that it's world building. That is, what kind of a world would you need to build in which slavery is unthinkable? Slavery is not possible because it's so crazy and foreign. So that's, and then you begin to bring it up to today and you say, there's a whole canon. There's Miriam Kaba and there's Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Angela Davis and Erica Miners and Gina Dent and Beth Ritchie and on and on. The writers, and all I wanted to do with this book was make an utterance in that conversation. But
Mhm.
all of those people would say to you, the question is, can you imagine a country without mass incarceration? Can you imagine it? And I think that Angela Davis, 25, 30 years ago, was the first person I knew who really put it so, so clearly. But what she made me think is let's do a little thought experiment. Rochelle and Bill are living in 1850, And we're in Philadelphia and Chicago, and we've got two little groups. You've got 20 people, I've got 20 people. And we're making plans because we're all abolitionists. And we dividing up work. We're saying, you write leaflets and op-eds and pamphlets, you lobby politicians, you get somebody elected, you build an underground railroad. We're all in it, but it's 1850. We're a teeny tiny minority. We're not only tiny, but we're against the Constitution, we're against the founders, we're against the Bible and our preacher, we're against our parents and our neighbors. Oh my gosh, we are terribly small, and our thinking is so outside the mainstream that we're easily dismissed. 15 years later, slavery would be gone. Holy cow, what
Yes.
happened? Well, many things happened, and we can't forget, for example, the power of the enslaved workers themselves self-liberating. That drove the crisis. But we also can't diminish the power of abolitionists raising the flag and saying, this is immoral, this is, and then, of course, a great civil war happens. So a lot changed. But I want to give you a more contemporary. That thought experiment is worth exercising because it should make us feel less powerless and less marginal than we sometimes feel. But I'll give you another example, Rochelle. Two of my students currently are out of prison, and they did one did 38 years and one did 42 years. They were arrested as young people. They got out in their 60s. Um, both of them were on death row, for one for 11 years and one for 13 years. Death row in Illinois. One of them, a man named Stanley Howard, had this idea. I'm going to start a law school class. He was maybe 19, 20 years old. I'm going to start a class, get some legal books from the library, have people bring me legal books, and I'm going to ask the warden if I can teach a class in the law. And the warden said, sure, because that would allow them to, keep them busy and so on. Stanley
Yes.
started a law class. When people came together for that class on death row, they recognized something. They shared a circumstance. And the circumstance wasn't just being on death row. It's that 10 of them were convicted under torture and false confessions. And this became a big scandal in Chicago. But this was 30 years ago. So you think you've got it hard being an organizer or an educator. Imagine being a 20-year-old on death row. They're going to kill you. And you say, you know what? I'm not going to be killed. I actually said to one of my students, Ronaldo, I said to him the other day, how did you get out of prison and hit the road running? So he said, I lived every day in prison as if I were free.
Mm.
People would say to me, why are you smiling? I said, I won't let them take my smile. I want them to let them take my humanity. So these 10 guys realized they'd all been tortured. And then they formed a group called the Death Row 10. And then they organized their mothers into the mothers of the Death Row 10, who met with the governor. That led to lawyers becoming involved, journalists, a social movement. So
Yes.
in 10 years, they had mobilized so many people that our Republican corrupt governor ended death row 20 years ago this year. Wow, what an amazing accomplishment. So we all feel like, not all of us, but I mean, I think we often feel ineffective, powerless, without agency. But if we think of ourselves as world builders, and we can
Yes.
imagine a world without mass incarceration, a world of self-care and mutual aid, if we can
Mm.
imagine it, we can work toward it. If we
That's
work
right.
toward it, maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. But working toward it is worth the effort.
That's right. It's worth the effort. It has been difficult. I think I find pockets of people to lock arms with. What concerns me is our, perseverance, right? Like the groups that we belong to that then in the face of the first set of adversity shrink back, and then you're back to the drawing board looking for a new group. you know but as you mentioned, what power was in groups of 20 people,
Yeah,
right? Who dared to imagine
right.
something different, dared to have courage to go against their minister, right? The government.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's so important. And I think in this period, we do well to continue with these thought experiments. One of the prompts that I often give to my students is, how's the world treating you? And how are you treating the world?
Yes.
I asked that question of my students a couple weeks ago, and then I followed it with, who are your people? Who claims you and who do you claim? So we began to write about our families and also our chosen families and who are our people. I think in this period, of all the things we should be doing, we should never miss the opportunity to gather our people in small groups, in large groups. So we have in Chicago, the young activists have begun it, but we're very much a part of what we call a movable feast. And it's a rotating potluck in which we get together just to experience joy, just to
Mm,
love each other. We don't have a political agenda. We don't, but we're all political people. We don't have
mhm.
to have a big meeting with, rules of order. We simply break bread together and love one another, which in a loveless world is a form of resistance.
Resistance.
I'm
That's
thinking of
right.
that great quote from James Baldwin, where he says, we need to create a revolutionary Black love against this loveless world. And
Mm,
I think that you can expand that any way you want to, but gather your people and
yes.
find joy, and that can lead to other forms of resistance. And the other piece I would add to that is, you're right. Every movement, we look back and we say, oh, that was easy. The 60s was whatever. Or we say, oh, the civil rights movement, I would have been on that bridge in Selma and I would have done this and done that. But the reality is every movement goes up and down and fluctuates. And the civil rights movement is no different. From the 50s to the 60s, it had high points and low points. It
Right.
won some victories. Some of those victories were reversed, but
Mhm.
people were on the move. And did it make a difference? It did. If you think it didn't, you weren't there. It did
Right.
make a difference. But at the same time, did it reach its ultimate goals and aspirations and North Star? It did not. That
Mm,
means we have work to do. Whatever the
that's right.
civil rights movement was, whatever the peace movement was, that was prelude to what
Mhm.
we have to do. And
That's
so
right.
I'm very much a person of this generation looking forward at the challenges ahead, not
Mhm.
looking back at with nostalgia for a ship that already left the shore. I'm
Right.
here now. I want to be free now, you know.
Yes, I know that's right. I want to be free now too, Bill. Let's be free together.
Absolutely.
But we do look back to those movements for instruction, right?
We
For
can get
what?
some instruction. That's true. We can get some
Yes.
instruction, but I'll tell you, for me, and I work mostly with young activists in Chicago in many different movements, but people often say, what advice do you have for young activists? And my response is, I mainly take advice from young activists.
That's right.
I have to learn, just like I was saying in the beginning, when you're a teacher, you're a student of your students. I don't have any great wisdom. If we were so smart, why did we lose so much? You know, uh,
Mhm.
there is that. I mean, I'll tell you, I do have one piece of advice, not just for young people, for myself, for all of us, which is, you can be right on an issue, but if you feel self-righteous, you're wrong. Your self-righteousness is what's wrong. So if you're better than other people and you know everything, you got nothing to learn, that's when you're off the tracks. So I've experienced that in my own life, in my own days of feeling like, damn, I'm so right about this that I have nothing to learn. That's always a mistake and it'll always take you off the rails.
Mhm. Yes, it will in every area of life.
Yeah, that's right. No,
Right.
you're absolutely right.
And generally, if we practice it in one area, we practice it in all areas.
Right.
You know,
Right.
like if you find yourself that way at home, you're that way out in the world because
You're
you
exactly
are everywhere you go.
that. You're exactly right. And I think there's an old slogan from the women's movement, and that is, the personal is political. If you're
Yes.
acting a certain way in your personal life, that's
Mhm.
political, and
That's right.
it's got a social aspect. Yeah.
Yes, it does. I I am so thrilled for this conversation. I keep thinking about how we move forward, how we move um, in collective liberation for our personal and collective liberation as we talk about, as we move into talking about some practical ways we can be in community. I mean, even though being in community is probably one of the strategies, but but also ways to maintain that hope that we have to maintain.
I think the way I maintain hope is that
Mhm.
I should say first that I'm often accused of being optimistic and a romantic and an idealist and a utopian, often. And I always say to people, guilty of being a bit romantic, guilty of being an idealist in the sense that I have ideals I want to live toward. But I'm not
Mhm.
an optimist. And the reason I'm not an optimist is because an optimist is a determinist. That is, they know what's going to happen. So they don't have to
Mhm.
do much because, hey, it's going to work out. A
Right.
pessimist is also a determinist. They know it's all going to go to hell. I don't know what's going to happen. And because I don't know, I choose to be hopeful. And I choose it because it gets me up in the morning and gets me out the door and into the world. I can wake up
Mhm.
every morning and say, maybe today will be free, and go to bed that night disappointed, but get up the next morning. And the reason is there's an historical reason for it. I have never seen a social movement or a revolution or a positive change that didn't begin with people saying it could never happen.
That's
That
right.
was true of abolition. It was true of Rosa Parks. The minute before she sat down on that bus, there had been a lot of women who'd sat down on buses. There had been a lot of civil disobedience over decades. And yet the week before Rosa Parks sat on that bus, which was a deliberate act of political activism, by the way, which but the week before, all the commentary was, ah, this is the way it is, it'll never change. The week after she sat in, it was inevitable. That's true of every revolution. Before it happens, it was impossible. After it happens, it was inevitable. So don't believe those guys. Keep walking. I'll tell you another funny quick story, but my wife and I had dinner with the great Uruguayan revolutionary Eduardo Galeano about 30 years ago. And we were comparing notes about being accused of being optimists and so on. And we both agreed that we were hopeful, we were not optimists. But he said, I'm often accused of being a utopian. And he said, one guy said to me, what good is utopia? And I thought about it. I said, well, you're right. If I take 2 steps toward utopia, utopia walks 2 steps away. If I take 10 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 10 steps away. So what good is utopia? And Galeano's response, it's good for walking, which I
Mhm.
love, because if you don't have a North Star, and it shouldn't be a dogmatic, fixed North Star, but if you don't have a North Star, why would you get up in the morning and walk and keep walking? So
Yes. Yes.
I'm very encouraged, Rochelle, by something that Miriam Kaba calls 1 million experiments. And what
Mhm.
she says is that in this country, at this moment, there are 1 million experiments going on toward liberation. Find them, join them, be part of them. In one place, it's a community garden. In one place, it's food distribution. In one place, it's supporting women's health. In another place, it's activism of some kind, defending, uh, Palestinian students. But whatever you are close to, name the obstacle to your freedom and to your neighbor's freedom. Pay attention to it, be astonished by it, get involved, do something, and then rethink. That to me is the rhythm of activism. Pay attention, open your eyes, be
Mhm.
astonished at the beauty and the ecstasy in all directions, as well as astonished at the unnecessary suffering. I hope I never
Mhm.
get used to seeing homeless kids in Chicago. I hope I cry every time because I
Mhm.
have to be astonished. Then I have to act, and then I have to doubt if my action meant anything. Go back to the beginning, pay attention, be astonished, act, doubt, repeat. So that's how I keep hopeful.
Yeah.
There's always stuff to do. There's always repairs to be made. And in this dire, dire moment, um, as I say, joy is an act of resistance.
Right.
Community is an act of resistance. but also we need to face each other honestly without pretenses and
Mm.
decide what we're going to do.
Yes, we do. And I appreciate your when you talked about the North Star. You know, one of my crazy ideas is that the legacy I want to leave is that 1 billion people on this planet have anti-racist, culturally competent educators.
Absolutely.
Like, in some ways it's crazy, but I also believe it's possible.
It's
Maybe not in
possible.
my, maybe not in my lifetime.
But you build the legacy. King was so
Yes.
brilliant at the age of 39 to say, I may not get there with you. Of
Mhm.
course, of course, we won't get to where we want to go in our lifetime, but
Yeah,
we can plant seeds. And
that's
in
right.
many ways, that's what organizations are. That's what movements are. They're
Mm.
seed planting enterprises. And other people will tend the garden. Other people will harvest the fruit. But you have and I think your aspiration, your North Star is so worthy. And especially at a time when, under the guise of anti DEI, you know what it reminds me of? You're not nearly as old as I am, but it reminds me of the affirmative action hire. Like
Yeah,
anyone who was Black who made it anywhere 20 years ago, oh, that was affirmative action, which
right.
is a lie. And now the
Mhm.
conversation about merit-based hiring, as if the
Mhm.
only people who can have merit are old white men. No, you
Mhm.
know, and so
Mhm.
so I admire your North Star, and I think in this period, it's a form of opposition and a form of resistance.
Yes, it is. And welcoming any and everyone who wants to join in that
Absolutely.
collective action, because it's possible. It's
Absolutely.
possible. We talked about, or I don't know if we talked about this in another conversation or whether it was in the book, right? You talked a little bit about kind of what it would take to shift things at a societal level, or shift ideologies, shift culture, that it's different than changing your mind as an individual, right?
Absolutely.
However,
Absolutely.
I'm not sure we disagree with one another. However, my approach has been to say, hey, if I truly believe that if the people educating our children are better and they understand how they're conditioned and they help children thrive, and they also see those children in not in stereotypical ways, right? See them all as with their agency, promoting their efficacy, that they are capable, that those same people, well, one, the children are going to have a better experience in our formal schooling system, but two, those people that they are nurturing and help raise to adulthood will become people who challenge that ideology when they
Right.
have political, or when they have power,
Right.
right? When they're in the workforce, when they're in politics, they will be different people
Right.
than we come out of all forms of education, not just public
Right.
education,
Right.
right? But all forms of education. So I do believe a there is an element to which we do have to address. It's really that addictive drug, right? Not just the privilege part of it, but literally how we understand who we are in this, in this
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And even just like the simple brain science of it all, that you're going to be tricked and duped because of the way your brain works if you don't check that.
Yeah, correct. Well, I think one of the things you're bringing to my mind is my mentor, Maxine Green at
Mm.
Teachers College, Columbia University. She used to say, teaching is world-changing work, but I might not change the world, but I might change the people who will change the world. And that
Yes.
kind of sense of longevity, I think, is important. I think you're also right to point to culture as a battlefield of change. I mean, if we want to live in a more joyful, a more just, a more peaceful, a more free society, it's important that we engage on the level of culture. And I
Yes.
think in many ways, I think that it's important to remember that if in a battle between, say, their army and our army, they win. In a battle between our imaginations and theirs, we could win. And I think partly we should free our imaginations to envision and build toward a society that is more free, more just, more peaceful, more loving. And I think that that is doable. The other thing you bring to mind that I think is hugely important is that individuals by themselves do not change the world. If you look at the great civil rights movement, the great abolitionist movement, the great women's movement, I often say to my students, are you against slavery? They all say, yes. I say, yeah, but if you were against it in 1855, and I say, are you for a woman's right to vote? And then I make sure the men are all nodding. Well, if you were for a woman's right to vote 100 years ago, or 110 years ago, you were against the Constitution and so on and so on. So I think it's important to recognize that things can change, that societies do pivot, and that culture is one of the places we need to pay attention to. When the current administration bans books, closes libraries, attacks universities, takes over the Kennedy Center for the Arts, those things are not trivial. Those things are meaningful. And we have to
Yes.
fight back by saying, free people read freely. We have every right to think, to learn, to study, and to challenge, and
That's
that's the right of a free people. And if it's not given to you, you have to take it.
Mm, History has taught us that.
You need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You don't
Yeah,
need your parents, your teachers, certainly not the government. So let's
that's right.
all get busy in projects of repair and study and learning. And I'm for your North Star. I'm in your army.
Bill, thank you so much. Thank you for just continuing to be generous,
Thank you so
right?
much.
With all of your knowledge and your experience. Is there a way people can find you after this
Easily.
episode? Ah,
Easily. I'm findable on all the social media, but certainly you mentioned Under the Tree, a seminar on
mhm.
freedom. Under the Tree is a reference to the freedom schools in the South because they didn't need brick and mortar. They met in community centers, they met in backyards, they met in parks, and they met under the tree. And they were striving toward liberation. That's one place I can be found. My email is easy. I mean, I, I'm at billayers.org, but I'm also at billayers123@gmail, and I have no problem giving that out widely.
Okay.
Says, fire away at me. I love being in touch with people, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone. So, Rochelle, I can't thank you enough for your time and for this effort, this podcast you're putting together. I think it's so important, and I know you've had a couple of my dear friends uh, visit with you. One is Kevin Kumashiro, one is David Stovall, and salute to them and salute to you for finding them.
Yes, well, thank you. And again, you have been a vicarious mentor for me. And now we are directly in touch. So you will be hearing more
Right,
more from me
right.
as we continue to get the word out among the
Let's
people. Yeah,
let's keep chopping it up
let's
until,
do it.
until we're free.
That's
All right,
right.
all right,
So
my
please,
friend.
thank you. And thank
Thank
you
you,
to
Rochelle.
everyone. Thank you to everyone who stopped by. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and share the episode. And thank you again for listening to Rooted to Thrive.